It's intrusive.
Welcome to, whoa, that's loud. Welcome to the Bothell City Council meeting of June 12th, 2018. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, all council members are here. Meeting agenda approval. Is there any changes to tonight's meeting agenda? Seeing none. Visitor comment. I don't have my little saying, but that's okay. Don't worry about it. We have one sign up. It's Lee Henderson.
Do I have to state my name and address? No. Hi, I'm Lee Henderson. I am the owner of Alexa's Cafe on Main Street. And for the last few weeks, I've been working with a couple of people from the city about the fact that the planter boxes on Main Street are dying and do not have any watering system. And apparently it has to do with the contracted landscapers from the project. And all I care about is we have 4th of July coming up, and we have an opportunity to show our city. Some people in this room might not have seen the thousands and thousands of people that come down, but it wasn't on Main Street last year, and it will be again. And so I'm going to either take it in my own hands somehow or need your help in getting this solved, in getting plants that are vibrant and plants that are nourished by water. They don't have any water at them right now, and they've been ignored for 6 weeks. And I brought it, and Paul Desilets brought it to the attention of the city that these plants they put in there were inappropriate and needed water and showed no vibrancy. So I'm asking for help in any way you can give it to me and the downtown merchants to get those planters filled. And again, I'm not asking you to solve the problem. I'm asking to be part of solving the problem. And you know, I've posed some ideas of us, you know, adopting the planter boxes, you know, each business, but we have an issue with, I'm about the only business that has water outside of it, you know, that has the opportunity to water something. So it has to be fundamentally fixed before, oh, she's got the green light. Anyway, I'm the only visitor. I probably could take 6, right? But anyway, I really like your help, and we just need help with however the contract is written, but I just really want to show it off for the 4th of July. So any questions? Comments?
City Manager, did you have a follow-up?
Staff is working very closely with the downtown businesses on this matter, and we're coming up with what I think will be a workable solution. So it's not that their requests have gone unheard.
Right.
The Assistant City Manager spent a tremendous amount of time with the downtown businesses. We're working through the contract. We're working with the Director of Public Works and her team. So we have spent a huge amount of time on this over the last couple of weeks, and I think we'll be very, very close, or we are very close to a resolution that I think will work for everyone.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Would you like to give a public comment tonight? No? Okay. There's no one else that wants to give public comment. We're opening the study session, AB 18-089, Downtown Plan Implementation Review. And we have Mr. Boyd to kick off a staff presentation.
Thank you, and good evening. So tonight we're talking about, this is basically a review of our downtown plan implementation. It's been 9 years almost since the plan was adopted in July of 2009. And I'm actually going to start with this cover slide. This shows the artist's rendering of a vision. And of course, this was never intended to be exactly how it was going to turn out. And it hasn't turned out exactly as shown here, but in large part, I think we are developing consistent with the vision that we set out in 2009 and that we've modified in the years since. So from my perspective, I'm going to go fairly quickly through kind of a recap and hit the high points of what was in the staff report, but mostly I wanted to reserve most of this evening for an opportunity to hear from council what their concerns and questions are about how development has been proceeding downtown, and have a conversation about that and how we can address any concerns and issues, help you better understand how we've been dealing with issues as they have arisen. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and move into the presentation. So we're going to talk about the downtown planning process. Where did we start, and what was the vision? Because it was a different council back in 2009. We're going to talk about the implementation to date, and as well as planned projects. So what's happened over the last 9 years, and we're going to talk a little bit about some upcoming projects. And then we're going to also talk about proposed plan and code amendments for this year, and the transportation impact fee proposal. We're asking for some more direction on that one, which are basically all items on our work plan for this year. So the downtown planning process, we're going to touch on a few steps along that, starting with the analysis of existing conditions, the community vision, city actions, the actual sub-area regulations that are the development code, and the planned action environmental impact statement and ordinance. We started off in 2005 with a real careful analysis of the existing conditions, past plans, and we put it all into a downtown digest that had the byline building on our first century and designing for our second. And we were about to celebrate our centennial. That was coming up in 2009. So one of the first things we did was we took a look at the downtown sub-area boundaries and made some adjustments. We decided that it was important to include the campus area in the downtown plan, and we also took out some areas south of the river. So we made basically the green belt along the river the southern boundary of the downtown, and really just included the commercially zoned areas in the downtown, and then the Sunrise Valley View single-family neighborhood, since it was there in between the campus and the downtown. One of the first things we looked at was the existing zoning, and the red overlay here wasn't part of the digest. I've highlighted the areas that back in, before we started the plan, had 65-foot height limits already. There was no limit on the number of floors, but that was the area that where 65-foot heights were available. The community vision of the downtown plan established a framework, and the area in the red there was the area where 6-story and when it was adopted, 65-foot heights were allowed. So we actually shrunk the area where 65-foot heights were allowed, and I just give that as a bit of background. It's a factor in our, at the time, we really didn't have a good, strong nexus for adding an affordable housing requirement, because we were actually, for the most part, ratcheting down the capacity in downtown plan. But I think it's an important factor to understand and consider. The community vision was built through a pretty robust community involvement process and resulted in this diagram kind of explains some of the key elements to really focus on the historic core there in the middle, to connect the campus to the downtown, it doesn't exactly show the realignment of 522, but that was always a big factor. And then the other big factor was the an SD property. We were acquiring 18 acres there and had a major opportunity to do some significant redevelopment right in the heart of downtown. So the next part of the downtown were the city actions, and there were 6 highest priority actions. Realigning 522, and that's been done. Second was to provide entitlements and a streamlined approval process. That was done and is an ongoing process to continue to tweak and improve that approval process. Redevelopment of the North Shore School District site, that's well underway, but ongoing as well. Transform the downtown portion of Bothell Way to the multi-way boulevard that we inaugurated last year. The new City Hall, of course, and both extending and redoing the existing Main Street and creating the flexible parking zones, which again is ongoing. The extension of Main Street will be done by the private development to the west. So we are making good progress on many of the highest priority actions. The next part of the plan is the actual sub-area regulation. So here again is that same zoning diagram with a little more detail. That's the district maps that really forms the framework for downtown development. And at the same time, we developed a planned action environmental impact statement that analyzed the impacts for the whole area, so that no individual project has to have a separate environmental determination or the threat of an appeal. The analysis for that planned action was done on the initially proposed development regulations, which actually the initial public review draft allowed 6 stories and 76-foot heights in the downtown core, stepping down from there. And so the changes that we've made since then to go back up to that 76 in the downtown core and 65 in the downtown neighborhood all were covered under the analysis that was done as part of the planned action, EIS. The EIS also established thresholds for development under that plan. So what we studied under those thresholds were the quantities of housing and commercial space. And then in this next section, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges we've encountered as we've gone through in implementation to date. So this chart shows where we are in terms of what has been built or is under construction, over 1,700 dwelling units and almost 500,000 square feet of commercial development. There's more that's been permitted or is under review. Some of those projects may or may not actually come to fruition. But if they all do, then we're close to 1,900 dwelling units and just over 500,000 square feet of commercial space. And then we've had early consultations about other potential projects that would take us up even higher. So we are getting to the point where we're going to need to do some careful analysis. And I think this is going to be a big part of next year's work program, is looking at those EIS thresholds and determining how to proceed, whether we should do a supplemental EIS, whether we just start handling projects that go beyond the threshold, have them do their own SEPA analysis and determinations. So that's on the horizon. So I wanted to touch on some of the issues that we've come across and some of the changes that we made. And I'm just giving a couple of examples. There could be many more. But in the report, we talked about maximum building length. That was one where the text of the plan always identified the primary building mass as the driving factor there. But the diagram didn't really reflect that, and the director's determination was made that the text was more specific and controlled in this situation. So the interpretation was to allow buildings like the 104, which has overall length larger than the allowed primary building mass, but the determination was made that these pieces that came out to the street really read as the primary building mass as you experience the building from the street. And we made code changes to reflect that determination, and those were adopted by council, I believe, in 2015, 14 or 15. So that's one issue, and I can point out on other projects how that's played out in some other circumstances. And another major one has been the building heights. There have been a number of amendments to the building heights. The latest one, the most significant one, where we went in the middle there to the IBC method of measuring height, largely to make it just more straightforward for both developers and reviewers to do that. Other than that, we've done smaller tweaks to address issues with access to underground parking and the need for a little more room for elevator penthouses. So the next section of the report had to do with this year's work program and the 5 potential plan and code amendments that are on the planning docket, as well as the proposed change to the transportation impact fee. So I'm just going to go through those fairly quickly, since we have discussed those at the docket discussion, and again fairly recently in the housing strategy discussion. The first 3 of these would create an opportunity for housing affordability requirements by increasing the capacity. So this first one deals with the 3-story overlay in the general downtown corridor district. Removing that would add some capacity and create the ability to have some affordable housing requirement there in that area directly across from the campus. It's mostly along Beardsley. There's a small area along Valley View here. We're just starting to analyze this. We'll be taking it to Planning Commission for a study session next month, and it won't be until fall that we'll actually bring back Planning Commission recommendations to council. But so there'll be plenty of opportunity for both public input and additional input from the council on whether and how extensive to make any changes here. Similarly, the downtown transition district density limits, they were removed in part by a previous council action, and we're looking at removing the rest of those density limit restrictions and adding an affordability requirement. The areas are along Lower Maywood, along 86th, and up off of 190th off of Bothell Way, and along West Hill, basically from Thorsk Street to Hall Road on the south. And then a rezone from general commercial to SR 522 corridor. This was an amendment that was made late in the downtown planning process to keep that GC zoning, and it creates some issues with how we apply the rest of the downtown regulations to a citywide zoning designation. And we've recently heard from owners in that area that would like to see this rezone move forward. And again, that would create an opportunity for affordable housing requirements. We're also looking at the public open space regulations, and these examples weren't included in the staff report, but I thought they could help with the discussion. The first project that came along was the 104, which included 3 public open spaces, courtyards. They were not able, or they requested to either pay a fee in lieu of their full open space requirement, and then ultimately also suggested that they could transfer some of that to Six Oaks that was being done by the same developer. The Six Oaks, even though it's a bigger project, has a smaller requirement because it's mostly in the downtown core district where there is no public open space requirement, since that is the most dense zero lot line zoning. So we did allow that, and their open spaces include the Six Oaks that they preserved, the small dog run and storm garden, rain garden, and some seating areas outside their rear entrance and exercise room. A couple of projects that are just finishing construction now, I also thought would be illustrative. The Addition apartments up on 185th between 102nd and 103rd. Also didn't feel that they were able to find a logical way to provide their full open space requirement on site, and requested to pay a fee in lieu of part of that, but they are including a 20-foot wide by about 150 foot long public open space along their north side that's also accessible at grade at the northeast corner and by some stairs near the west end of it. The Mercantile building isn't quite as far along, but its public open space will resemble the Additions. It'll also be a 20-foot setback along the north side along Main Street. And again, since they are, that's a split zone lot that's mostly in downtown core, they had a smaller open space requirement. So we'll be looking at whether the requirement is, whether we're requiring the right amount, whether that's a reasonable amount, and we'll also be looking at the fee in lieu, what circumstances should we allow the fee in lieu to be used, and how do we manage that, any fee in lieu money that we get to direct it to projects within the downtown sub-area, and to do it in a way that's consistent with our parks and open space impact fees. And then the final code amendment is we're looking at the design review process for downtown projects. The downtown plan established a downtown special review area, basically from 522 on the south up to 185th on the north, from Bothell Way on the west over to 104th on the east. Any development proposal in that area that meets SEPA thresholds needs to be submitted to the Bothell Landmark Preservation Board for review and comment and the code currently, and this is the code language, requires that to happen prior to any grading or building permit being issued. We have always encouraged projects to come in much sooner than that. We've encouraged them to come in before they actually apply for building permits, and for the most part that has happened, but we are going to be looking at that whole process and whether we need to make some changes and perhaps make that a requirement that it happens before building permits are applied for. And then transportation impact fees, and I'm going to pass that to Mike and or Aaron.
Actually, I think to both of us. So this is something that came to the council back in March, and I know there were some concerns raised at that time and some questions. I think question about the boundary, how the boundaries were chosen, and then also about whether this would actually create an incentive for demolition over preservation. So we haven't started that process yet, but we wanted to come back to you since we're doing the rest of the downtown discussion at this time and see if there are any other questions, or just to confirm that we got the questions right from what we heard back in March, as well as any additional questions or concerns that you might have as we go forward and do some additional analysis on this. I don't know if, Aaron, if you want to add anything to that.
Okay. And that concludes the presentation. We're open to any questions. And like I said, we really want to hear from you about concerns you have, concerns that you've heard from constituents, and additional direction to us. I have had the opportunity to speak to at least one council member about concerns that they've heard, and I understand that the bigger concern are the projects that are up on the hills away from the big wide boulevard, the scale of those, on the narrower streets in the older downtown core. And we will certainly be taking those concerns into account as we look at these code changes and potential changes that might be needed in the future. But with that, I'm going to sit down, and I can move back to any of the images that you want to see. I've got a remote here, so.
So just a process question, the different items that we already have on the docket that are being, going through the planning commission process, did you say you want us to weigh in on those now, or those are coming later to council, and what we're trying to talk about now is additional items in the downtown?
It's actually a little bit of both. So what Dave highlighted tonight are some things that are on the docket, as you pointed out, and we have some direction from the council already on that. We wanted to make sure that if there's anything else on that we haven't already heard from you that you would like us to consider as we take this through the planning commission, this is an opportunity to give us that additional direction. So that's part of it. And then the other piece is, as Dave mentioned, if there are other things that have come up that we haven't touched on yet that are maybe outside the docket or expand on the docket a little bit, those items that are related to the downtown, we'd like to hear about that this evening as well, so that we can package that with other things as appropriate as we take these through the planning commission. Okay. But everything will be coming back to the council. We hope sometime later this year is our plan at this point.
Okay. So I think it would be interesting at least to hear from the council, and I'd like each one of you to take a turn about whether or not we want to expand, whether or not you personally want to open up the downtown plan further than it currently is proposed to be opened. We have those 7 or 6 different things that are already in the pipeline. And so what I'd like to know, because, well, I'll hold my comments. I don't want to sway anybody. So who would like to go first? Deputy Mayor.
So we're going to weigh in first and then ask questions?
Yeah, what I'd like to do is the council just to sound off so we make sure we have a majority that is interested in even opening up the downtown plan further than the amendments that we already have on the docket.
Okay. So I would like to open up the downtown plan for potentially additional design review requirements such as building heights, massing, setbacks, design standards, that sort of thing. I'd love to see some sunshade diagrams as far as what sunlight we can expect to have on the street. Specifically, this is so loud, sorry. Specifically, I noticed in the EIS statement that there are comments about historic resources, and yet I don't think that we have anything in place to really preserve historic Main Street. I know that most of one block has been sold except for the Hannon building and anything east of the Gallo d'Oro. That's one block out of what I would consider 4 of historic Main Street that probably is gone already. And I think now is the time, if we're going to do something to preserve historic buildings or facades or whatever, now's the time to really revisit that and think about what we can do to preserve that. I know it came up in branding where we talked about attractions to the city and how historic stuff is, that's a tourist attraction. I went to Boston and the first thing I did was the Freedom Trail, and so did thousands of other people. So I think this is a very important aspect of Bethel's identity. So I'd like to see us open historic Main Street and design standards and whatever else we might do to preserve it.
All right, who would like to go next? Sorry to put you on the spot. I could go if you want me to. Councilmember Zorns.
It's a stream of consciousness, so apologizing now. I would be strongly interested in opening up the downtown plan again. Part of what I see is, because as a community member I was heavily involved in weighing in as a community member how the plan was impacting, and I wasn't the only one there. I mean, there were a lot of people invested in it. What I sense, and I could be wrong here because it's happened before, what I sense is a plan that has had a lot of thought invested into it, and so now it has become our first fallback for attaching affordable housing to it, attaching more to it. When there's more of Bothell that needs attention, we've got Canyon Park. We have, what were you talking about? The general, is it GC? What's the general district that we want to see if we could expand and put multifamily in as you head out west on 522, right?
General downtown corridor?
Yeah, no, not
District? No.
GDC. General commercial.
Along SR 522.
Right, right. And I would like to see housing, the expansion of housing put in areas that we haven't already talked about. Because what I'm concerned about, and I know I've mentioned it before, as you move east up Main Street, that valley floor gets narrower and narrower. The two hillsides come closer and closer. And we're talking about Bus Rapid Transit coming down 185th. Is it 10 buses, 10 minutes apart? 10 minutes apart. And so I'm looking at a very narrow street and a narrow valley floor, and we're talking about putting more demands on that road. And 50 years down the road, maybe that will just, this area will be just transit only. You know, it won't be a shared road for vehicles. The more demand we put on the road, how are we going to share it? Are we going to condemn properties along Beardsley Boulevard to widen out and make it feasible to allow traffic to go through? It feels like we're taking a complicated problem and making it more complicated. So opening the discussion back up, I think has merit of, is it fully in balance as we look at the demands that we want to place on the landscape? And then you talk about taking density limits off of transition areas. And I had reservations then, I have reservations now. I sit next to an area that has no density limits. But if you're talking, I think, Dave, you mentioned, is attaching, if we take it, the areas that do have density limits, and we attach affordable housing to it, yeah, that's some squidging room that interests me. You know, maybe we can accommodate that and function effectively as a community. I know we're talking about getting more teeth in how we preserve our historic downtown. I hate to always be setting Edmonds up as an example. They have a 35-foot limit for their main street, and they have it there for a reason. And then the other thing, you talk about us getting close to reaching the threshold on the EIS. I'm concerned that we'll blow right past that, and then what's the can of worms that we've opened up for ourselves? And then just one other question that I have is, I'm just going to tell you straight up front, I am confused about the maximum building length. So at some point, a little more hand-holding would be nice. I mean, and maybe you can answer the question for it now. Was it trying to juggle pervious soil? Because we're talking about properties that were joined into one mass project. And so when the building length became longer than initially planned, were those courtyards there to accommodate pervious soil? I was trying to connect dots on that and wasn't able to when I was going through the material today, or this weekend.
Would you like me to address the questions? I'd be happy to.
I'd rather just kind of get through the council if
Okay.
we could, and then,
Okay.
yeah, we'll.
Well, at some point, maybe as an
Yeah,
aside, you can explain that to me.
I'm making a note of it here.
So, the recommendation to open up the downtown plan and do a little more dissecting of it, yeah, I think it would probably be a prudent idea. So that's where I weigh in.
Mayor, could I ask a clarification?
Yeah, sure.
On one of those items? So you talked about looking outside of the downtown for additional housing. That really goes beyond the scope of what we would do in the downtown plan itself. That's something that we would revisit as part of the overall comprehensive plan.
Right,
So
right.
Okay, so I
I
just
just,
want to make sure I
it just,
understand.
it just feel, I'm sorry, I interrupted. It just feels like the full focus of putting affordable housing is here on downtown when Bothel's bigger than just downtown. That was my only point.
Okay, we can look at that in the context of the downtown. I just wanted to be clear that we're not looking at the entire comprehensive plan and housing
No,
capacity citywide.
No,
Okay.
no. So it would help for me is that as we talk as a city about this, is that we're talking about where housing is happening in other parts of our planning.
Okay.
Because right now, we seem to be our active focus is solely on downtown.
Okay,
We will be bringing some proposals that will address affordable housing in other parts of the city this year even, so.
That's reassuring to hear. Thanks.
Also, just to follow up on the clarification, I heard you say you want to put housing in areas that don't allow it now. And what we're looking at doing with the rezone from GC to SR 522 would do that. GC
Right.
doesn't allow. So that's,
Right. Oh, that
Okay.
made perfect sense to
Okay.
me. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Who would like to go next? I can, all right, I'll go. You guys want to wait? So, for the last, well, I guess 6.5 years, these are loud today. The downtown revitalization plan has been a cornerstone of my experience as a council member. I think we've seen huge investment and interest regionally. I mean, I can't tell you how many times a week people tell me, like, wow, what you guys have done downtown is amazing. I have a lot of concern about a chilling effect if we go publicly say as a council that we're opening this whole thing up and we're going to start looking at it. So I have a whole lot of reluctance to say, yeah, let's open this thing up. With one exception, because at the same time I hear, well, maybe not once, many times a week, but people really do appreciate that we have a historical Main Street. And that is an attraction to the city. So if there's things that staff propose we can do to try to make those facades survive the redevelopment that's imminent, I'm very interested in hearing about those. But outside of that, I got to be honest with you. It's just like, why would you beat up, think a good thing that's happened to the city? I mean, we've made a huge investment as a city, the whole city, 40-some thousand people invested a lot of money into this downtown in infrastructure. And to not benefit from that as a city, just see the redevelopment happen in response to that, I think would be financially tragic as well as just disappointing in general to see the downtown not revitalize this plan. So that's where I'm at on a happy note. Councilmember Agnew.
I agree with the mayor that I think what we have going is a good thing. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But I'd be reluctant to open up this entire thing. I mean, the one thing I was concerned about is in the GC zone and getting affordable housing in there, but it already sounds like we're talking about that, so I'd be happy with that. But I'm not in favor of opening up this.
Councilmember Olson.
I think I'm leaning towards what the mayor is speaking here, but also I think I'm hearing from everyone along the line so far is that Main Street is a very precious piece for us, especially with, the work that was just done on Main Street, capitalizing on what we have there. I think we want to keep that feeling, keep that whole sense of historic Main Street. If we can preserve the buildings, that'd be great. Plan B, keep the facades, keep the feeling of it, establish some setbacks so we don't have canyons and the shading, and just keep it a vibrant street that we can do festivals on and really use that space and keep it just as a gathering place for everyone. I think the rest of the 7 items that were brought up here are quite a bit in there already. I don't know if we want to overtax the planning department by just biting off too much at one time. I mean, as long as we can get the Main Street in there, I'd like to see that as an addition. And also with the planned action EIS, it sounds like that we might be coming up against the limits of that when we still have some key properties that we want to develop. And I think if we have to extend that, do an amendment onto that, I think that'd be very important to get some of those pieces of city-owned property, especially right in the gateway on the multi-way boulevard, just so that we don't have to, or we don't put additional roadblocks on getting those developed, because I think those were pieces that were desired a long time ago to already be open and operating and, extending the Main Street feel and drawing more people in. So I think it's critical that we continue the whole idea of having the environmental aspect of it checked off so that it's not another roadblock slowing down for those properties.
Councilmember McAuliffe?
Thank you. So I will first start with the fact that Main Street is just recovering from 1 to 2 years of actually being shut down, and all of the work that we've done. So we need to leave them kind of blossom now and not change things on them, because if you ever want to do any historic preservation, it's got to be about incentives and not about overlaying policies or laws upon them. So that's kind of my feeling, is they're just starting to grow, and we should just kind of wait a little bit till we kind of allow them to become what they should be. It's a beautiful spot. I mean, really, what we've done on Main Street is amazing. Other than I can't park, but I'm still practicing. I'll get it one day. I need a camera or a ding, ding, ding or something like that, right? But no, it is beautiful. And the merchants are really happy. But if we ever do anything as well, because Davina, I'm thinking of what you're saying, then we have to do it with the merchants and with the property owners. We have to bring them in and, again, revisit what they want to do. Because years ago, that is what happened, and I don't know how many years, but we increased the building heights, we did the setbacks, I should say the city, with the input of the property owners, and I think if we're ever going to do anything, we have to do that again. And then, of course, one of the things I would really, really love to see if we ever get there is the connection of the University of Washington, Cascadia Community College to downtown Main Street, so the boulevard. I know it's on the plans, but getting there is a really big thing. But it's critically important to our downtown as well. So I agree with the mayor. Let's not open downtown. Let's give them a chance to kind of flourish.
Councilmember McNeil?
So I heard a lot of in Dave's presentation about community vision and stakeholder groups. There was a process. So in listening to all of you kind of speak, I'm kind of on the same lines of not reopening it. I think Main Street has a special place in the history of Bothell. I agree with the Councilmember McAuliffe about there was a process. The businesses got together through that process and allowing them to make sure they have a voice on what that's going to look like. And I think that, saving facades is a very important piece there. but also making sure that we're communicating with the businesses on Main Street is an important piece of that. Finding affordable housing, things like that throughout this process, I think is going to be critical for us, because I think this council, I've heard many times we've sat on the dais and we've talked about trying to find ways to create affordable housing. Where that affordable housing comes from, I thought I heard Dave several times mention that that's part of what's going to go to the Planning Commission, and we're going to start hearing about in the future. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, we'll be bringing the sort of foundational requirements that Planning Commission has already helped develop to council on July 3rd. So we are going to start making some moves in that direction.
Okay. So I'm not for reopening, making sure we continue to work towards saving historical facades of buildings on Main Street. Should I ask a question about other items that I think potentially could be missing now, or should I wait until we open it up again?
Well, I think, so we've heard from the council that we're not really interested in reopening the downtown revitalization plan.
Okay.
So if you have other we can talk about things about docketing in the coming years. We could talk about, well, we talk about whatever we want as long as it has something to do with the downtown. But I think we heard from the council pretty clearly that I think we want to hold the line and continue with the downtown revitalization plan as is. I think we heard too that there's interest in, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm saying this, but I think we heard that we want to do something about the historical buildings along Main Street, mainly between 101st and 103rd. It sounds like the council would like to do that in cooperation with the property owners and the merchants that are there. But that's not exactly a docketing process, and I don't even know what that process, I don't have any good suggestions on how that process would play out, but.
And that is something, all the things that we're talking about here that are going through the process with the Planning Commission and the City Council, we will be reaching out to the community, the business owners and property owners specifically that are affected by this. So there will be that engagement as we go along through that process. That was one of the things I wanted to follow up on. I heard very, very clearly from the council, and that's always important. The second item related to some of the historic preservation and particularly some of the design review comments that Deputy Mayor Doer mentioned. Part of the docket that you approved back in March was consider amendments to clarify and improve design review process for the downtown. So I don't think we're talking about a deep dive there, but there are certainly some things that we can look at as we go through this process, some of which will touch upon preservation related to the historic buildings in the downtown blocks.
I also,
Good.
can I
Go ahead.
add to that I meant to mention this when I was talking about the design review, but Sarah Desimone, our historic preservation consultant, has been working with the Landmark Board on a grant from For Culture to look at measures for improving our ability to preserve those historic buildings on Main Street and beyond. So that's just starting. There's not a whole lot to report back on that yet, but we are pursuing that as well.
Okay, great. So I stole the floor from you, Councilmember McNeil. So you have the floor now, so we've kind of laid that to bed. And City Manager, you're kind of looking at me with that look.
I guess I just want to be sure that the CD staff, do you need more feedback from the council with regards to what their vision is for a preservation of a historical Main Street? Or do you feel that you understand what that is from a planning perspective and can bring back what you think is appropriate?
Thank you for that, because what I think I heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, generally speaking, is that you're looking at some, you'd like to see some options for preserving the historic buildings if possible, or at least the facades, and maintain that historic character of the downtown. And I see that as sort of maybe a couple of alternative things that we can look at. One, as Dave mentioned, we're pursuing a grant to do some additional research on a study on what can be done to help encourage or incentivize preservation of buildings, incentives, as Councilmember McAuliffe talked about. If that's not possible, and in some cases it may not be possible or feasible or practical to preserve the buildings, to at least look at ways that we can preserve that facade. That would include things like step backs, so we're not creating the canyon effect, and you get that feel as you're walking along the street. So that's what I heard. Is that kind of what you heard as well?
Yeah, and I would say that the downtown plan does include pretty significant protection. So that's part of what we'll be looking at. Are those strong enough? What can we do to improve the process again, so that Landmark Board gets a say in projects earlier on? We already do have upper level setbacks along Main Street that are in place, and other historic requirements and guidelines. So you can see that at the Mercantile Building. They haven't restored the cornice that was damaged in the fire, but that is coming, and the taller building does set back 20 feet as required along those streets. So there is. It's not that we don't have any protections now, but we'll be looking at whether we need more, and we're already doing analysis of the block that Deputy Mayor Doer mentioned that has lot EFG and the Hannon Building, and looking at which of those buildings are eligible for historic register and how that might play out in redevelopment of properties along that block. So.
I would just add one other component to that that I didn't hear mentioned, but it might be a Plan C. If Plan A is the preservation of the building, Plan B is the preservation of the facade, where those two may not be possible, but Plan C would be having some design regulations in place so that any new structure would at least be complementary to the existing historic character of the downtown. And that's an important piece of that as well. I don't want to lose sight of that. So it's not always possible to save the building or the facade.
All right, thank you. Councilmember McNeil, we robbed the floor from you for like 20 minutes. Sorry about that.
It's all good. That was very helpful. So I like Plan C idea. I think it's great. I think in the last council meeting, we had a business owner, if I'm not mistaken, from Main Street come down and speak to us about not reducing their ability. So that weighs heavily on my mind that person did come and speak to us about that. So facades are very important, and I think through design and through review, you can come up with a way to create, if you have to remove something that's kind of identical looking to that facade with the setbacks as well. So there was something, we briefly went over traffic impact fees in the downtown area. Is that correct? We're going to hear more about that?
Well, we raised it again this evening because it had come up, I think, back in March. And we just wanted to touch base again with the council on that before we go forward with any additional analysis on it, because you would ask us to come back with that.
So is there different approaches to the impact fees that would be downtown? Can you explain that a little bit to me?
Sure. So at council's request, staff came back with an analysis that our consultant did about the internal capture of this Main Street area, really recognizing that people in certain parts of town, they will drive in just to go to a restaurant. But the idea with Main Street is to treat it more like there are quite a few people who come down and say get their hair cut and then have lunch. So that there's more than one activity that happens with a lot of those trips. And to really encourage the pedestrian nature of the Main Street, those few blocks of the Main Street area that we studied, was to really change or lower the impact fee rate for things like restaurants and grocers, small grocers, to perhaps encourage some transformation of some of the spaces that are currently there. Because, for example, retail, traffic impact fees, general retail and furniture retail in particular are very low compared to restaurants. So I think the square footage traffic impact fee for a furniture store is less than $1 per square foot, and a restaurant is around $39 per square foot. So you can see that if we're trying to encourage more pedestrian-oriented uses, that that delta to come in and change the use from, say, a furniture store to a restaurant is going to be a significant impact for someone. So the proposal was to lower it about $13 a square foot for restaurants, for example. So that, I mean, it's still not going to be as inexpensive as a standard retail establishment, but it is lower because it does recognize that there are multiple activities for peak vehicular trips.
So it sounds like it kind of removes a barrier, but then incentivize that business to come in, and then gives more opportunity for us to frequent one business and go to another. Like if you eat dinner and then you want to go have, ice cream or something like that afterwards.
Right.
So it's kind of like a mall approach. Okay.
Similar, yes.
So I'm on board with that concept of how to charge for that. So just so you know that I'm supportive of that. Okay. How we looked at parking at all? Parking?
So I didn't include that. That was actually another amendment that was in the docket, but it's going to be wrapped up in the kind of a broader downtown parking management plan. So that also is going to be going forward starting this summer, taking a closer look at the parking.
Okay, so I guess what I'm getting from you is we're looking at a bunch of things kind of overall in helping with our planning process, right? So when we're looking at affordable housing, we're looking at parking, we're looking at traffic impact fees. So we're not looking at individual pieces, we're looking at a whole big picture, which is, I think, was what we want to be doing, correct? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I think I'm good, thanks, Mayor.
One other thing on the transportation impact fees, so it's not just multiple trips when you drive downtown, it's also all of the residents that are downtown that don't have to drive at all to patronize these businesses. So that's the one where the mall analogy doesn't necessarily fit, because most malls don't have the amount of housing that we're building downtown.
Councilmember McAuliffe.
So my first question would be, when you look at Main Street, how do you decide what is a historic building? I mean, how do you identify a historic building?
We might want to ask Sarah to help us out here, but I'll start. So in our code, any building that's more than 15 years old is eligible for our historic inventory, is essentially on our historic inventory. 50.
Oh, not 15, 50.
50. But that does mean that the buildings that were built now, that were built in 68, are becoming eligible. So that is a factor, and basically any of the existing buildings on Main Street are potentially eligible. Almost every building on Main Street. And so when an applicant comes to me and asks what are their requirements, I usually do turn to Sarah and to do an analysis, and that's what we did for the block that EFG is on, and she did an assessment based on how much of the original structure and elements, details are there. To what degree have they been modified? In some cases, if a building has been, even if it's been significantly modified, but the modifications are considered historic at this point, those can be considered historically significant and potentially even eligible for the register. So there are a lot of factors that go into that.
And the standards we have for the local register are much lower than what the state and federal use. So we also take into consideration, and Sarah can check me if I'm wrong here. She's been educating me on this, so we'll see if I've been listening. It may also have to do with the local history of the building. So it may have been, who owned the building at one time, if it was one of the pioneer families, for example. If it was designed by maybe a local architect who had some regional significance in terms of the work that they've done. So there are other things that go into it. It may not be about the building architecture itself. It may be about the history of the building as opposed to, any type of design of the building.
So I guess, given, you know, kind of our value, which we have, of a historic Main Street. I'm very much supportive of like what Snohomish has done and Kirkland has done, so you can kind of go up above and do affordable housing and do apartments and kind of still maintain the facade. I think that's critically important, because if you're going to get people to kind of live and shop and work in the area, that really helps the businesses on Main Street. Whatever we can do, oops, there it goes, sorry. Whatever we can do to help the businesses flourish is what's critically important. So I really like it when you talk about, let's go to dinner, let's go shopping, let's do whatever we can do to keep everybody walking and patronizing Main Street. So yeah, I'm all into incentives for the historic buildings. That's critically important to me. And I think what we heard, as you said, Councilman McNeil, from George Ahern, is they just kind of negotiated on building heights, and they would like time to kind of really utilize what they negotiated. So I think that let's let the vision become the reality, as he said.
Deputy Mayor?
I don't know if we're asking questions or making comments anymore. So I guess I'll start with my questions. So the carriage house proposal, that didn't show up, but I thought we were all in favor of it. So is that still on the docket?
That's going to Planning Commission tomorrow night for a study session, and back to them for a public hearing July 11th.
Okay.
And that goes beyond the downtown.
Yeah. And then, so I just want clarification. Do we know what these various proposals for increased height limits, what kind of yield those are on population, potentially?
We haven't done that analysis yet, but that'll be an important early stage in looking at those, because in order to determine what an affordability requirement would be, what percentage of affordable units would be required and at what level, we work with our ARCH to do pro formas, basically analyzing what the additional capacity is, so that the intent is for it to become a zero-sum game, so that the affordability requirement is paid for essentially by the additional development.
When is our next comp plan update, like required with new population growth targets?
2023.
So it's in 2023. If I'm correct, though, none of these, if we pass them this year, would it be applicable to the new growth targets?
Well, anything we do that increases our capacity would help us when we get to that point.
Because I guess my understanding, or at least maybe I misunderstood, is that anything you do outside the comp plan, the 8-year comp plan update doesn't count towards your targets that you're given by PSRC. Is that not true?
That's not my understanding. I think what we do when we go through the comprehensive plan process is we have a growth target that we have to plan for. So we have to demonstrate in our comprehensive plan how we can accommodate that growth, both population and employment growth. So it doesn't matter when we've done that increase, as long as we can demonstrate we have that capacity there.
Okay. I just feel like I've heard over and over again it doesn't count unless you're doing it in the year of the comp plan update.
I think they don't continually adjust the targets as you make changes between comp plan updates. So, but when we do our comp plan update, we would count all of these, any adjustments.
So these would count toward whatever number we're given?
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, because that was a huge concern for me if we're talking about a large population increase and we don't get credit for it towards the comp plan update. I wanted to mention another thing that I think we need to look at in regards to the open space requirement is the fact that the junction was able to put in open space, but it's not open to their public. It fulfilled what I heard was that it fulfilled their obligation, and yet it's not open to the public. Is that correct? Those big terraces that they have are not open to the public, but that fulfilled their open space requirement.
Those upper level terraces they go towards their private outdoor space requirement. Their public open space requirement is all accessible to the public, and they got credit for building the open space along Popkini Way.
Okay, I had heard differently, so I'm glad to hear that. In regards to the traffic impact fees, I'm still torn about it, and I understand, I mean, I have clients all the time that do change of use, so I understand, you know, that it stunts potential growth. And for that reason, I would like to know what other cities do, and if it might actually make more sense to have a citywide reduction in the change of use traffic impact fee. It seems to me that that might be worth looking at. I had the owner of Uncle Pizza's talk to me about how stifling he found the traffic impact fees, and he believed that was why the Safeway development is not full. And so I just wondered if it was worthwhile. I talked to one of the other mayors, and we were interrupted, so we didn't finish our conversation, but she said, yeah, Kirkland did something special around change of use because it seemed to be stifling business, those impact fees. So I would be interested in knowing what some of the other alternatives might be, and if it is in fact stifling growth, because we're about to lose Country Village and those, you know, those sales tax revenues. It seems like we've lost a lot of retail. We're gaining a lot of restaurants, but we're losing retail, and I don't know how that might impact that sort of growth. I'm no expert. I'm just asking the question if there are alternatives. So when I look at the EIS statement, there's a lot in there about historic resource protection. I mean, it's very clearly points out in the diagram historic Main Street. And so I just wanted to make because I don't know if we're doing questions or comments or both, I'm just gonna go there. So in our council retreat, the city manager talked about solastalgia, which is the loss of the feeling of not recognizing home. And I think Bothell, we probably all agree, the heart and identity of Bothell is Main Street. And so, you know, if you look at Bothell then and now, I think a lot of people look on Main Street and they see a bunch of buildings that look very outdated. What they don't see is what's underneath and could be revealed. And so not just preserving those facades, but encouraging restoration or the uncovering of what they are. I think that's a really important element to that. I look at Alexa's and think, man, if that could happen up and down the street, that would be really powerful, and it would be a huge attraction. And like I said, we had a long discussion actually in the branding, my branding group, and how Bothell's lacking some of the tourist attractions. And boy, we have something really special on Main Street that other cities long for. Kenmore doesn't have a Main Street. You know, Woodinville doesn't have a Main Street. I moved here for Main Street, and I'm not the only one. I talk to my neighbors and friends, and even though it's maybe not the most beautiful, there's something about the scale of it, which is what I'm concerned about. When you look at 6 stories, I would like to see examples of other cities that have even a 20-foot setback with 6 stories and what that looks like. Because when I think about cities and their main streets, I think of Snohomish. They don't have apartment buildings that I know of up above historic Main Street. I was just there, but I didn't see them. So if there's an example, I'd love to see it. Kirkland, I look at that Main Street, I don't see huge apartment buildings above those, but maybe I'm missing something. I see 2 to 3-story buildings like Edmonds. So I would really like to see that successfully done. If it's done, I'd like to see those examples because I don't see them. And I remember when I was in the group when we did downtown revitalization, and the whole reason we have an L shape is because we were going to expand on 527 in order to preserve Main Street. I don't think preserve meant tear it all down and start over again. That was not my recollection. And then as far as the building facades and whatnot, I have concerns about if we do have 6 stories in apartment buildings, what does parking look like at that point? We already have a parking issue. What does it look like when we have more? And I don't know what we'll decide and what you'll recommend. But I don't think it's outlandish to think about not having apartments on a couple of blocks of Main Street. I think that should at least be on the table and discussed about the pros and cons. Again, I think we need a sunshade studies because that street's fairly narrow. It's not awfully wide, and it's also south facing, it's north-south facing, so it's going to be shaded at the highest point of the sun during the day. And like I said, I'm just very concerned about the potential when we know most likely that one block is almost gone. If the Hannon building had been sold as well, that would be gone too. And so I'm feeling particularly that Main Street is vulnerable to development. And when you give them 6 stories, there's every incentive in the world to just tear them down. We have no teeth. All we can do is ask, and we've been lucky so far that the Mercantile did that. But, I mean, they really could have done anything they wanted. They could have torn it down, correct? I mean, I know you do your best to talk them into it, but as far as I remember, we don't get to say no, thank you.
We can't, I don't think we can say absolutely no, but there is some teeth in the code in terms of requiring certainly the upper level step backs. But you're right, the first developer that came in looking to purchase that property, when we encouraged them to preserve some or all of the existing buildings, said it just didn't pencil out for them, and we were happy that they walked away in the end. But we do have some teeth to compel developers to preserve, especially buildings that are eligible for the historic register, but it's not an absolute.
Yeah, and I guess while I understand people buy land with the intent of making money, I don't believe our job is to preserve that investment. I believe our job is to look out for the whole of Bothell and what's best for all of Bothell. And as far as I'm concerned, what's best for Bothell is that we have that identity and we preserve what's special in Bothell. And so that's my number one goal. It's not that I don't care about the business owners, but I think what's best for the business owners is a thriving Main Street that people want to go to. And that should be the number one goal. And then the other thing that I thought I might add in there is retail requirements and whether or not we need to revisit requirements as far as how much of that storefront or whatever should be retail. I've heard, that maybe there's a little bit of playing around with what's retail or just adding a little retail to kind of fulfill the requirement, but it's not really a retail business. And I think it's worth revisiting that to make sure that we have the right regulations as far as requiring that retail component. And I think I'm finally at my end. Thank you.
Would any other council member like to talk about the downtown while we have the staff assembled and ready to go? Councilmember Zorns?
Just really quick, I would like to echo what Deputy Mayor Doer said about encouraging retail, because we have allowed some of those retail opportunities to go away, and we can't strong arm anybody to create retail, but I would love it as a city if we can figure out how to encourage retail and hold our ground on preserving those spaces for retail and not allow them to just kind of get absorbed into other interests in the building, and we lose that retail opportunity.
Councilmember McAuliffe?
So, sorry about this, but 25 years ago, when we did the revitalization of downtown Bothell, we required that there be retail on the main floors. Now, I don't know why we got away with it, but we did. So is there something that you can require a certain amount of retail?
We do require ground
We
floor
do.
retail
Okay.
on Main Street from 102nd to Bothell Way, and along Bothell Way from 522 to 186th.
So it is
basically.
required.
Yes. We don't have a specific standard for how deep that retail space needs to be, so we have had to kind of negotiate with some potential tenants. If you recall to the previous incarnation at the Mason's Lodge, when it was Wee Honeydew and Brew, their initial proposal was just to have the construction offices there, and we said, no, you need to have a retail front. So that's how Brew came to be there. Similarly, the Harmony Massage
Yes,
is
exactly.
required to have a retail space in the front. So, but we don't have. Basically, an applicant needs to convince us that it's a viable retail space.
So I agree with Councilman Zorns that that's really critically important that we keep that part of Main Street to require a certain amount of retail. I know the yoga studio doesn't have it.
Yeah, and there was when we did the downtown plan, we tried not to create non-conforming uses. So we allowed yoga studios, karate studios to be in the classification of health and fitness clubs, which are allowed on Main Street. But we've encouraged even those uses to have some retail component in the storefront.
Perfect. I like that. Thank you.
All right, any other questions or comments from council? No? Okay. I think you got what you needed? Yeah?
I think so.
Okay.
So we'll be coming back. As I said, we've got work to do with the Planning Commission. We'll be coming back to the council later on this year. If there's some other things that come up, we may come back and check in with you just to make sure we're still on the right track. But you'll get another shot at all of this, at least one more, as we come back with draft ordinances and code amendments for you.
So just for my benefit, the park impact fee thing and having those little frontages and whatnot, that's going to come back anyways? That's already on the docket for Planning Commission and then to come back to council?
Yes.
That one yeah. Thank you. Okay, good.
I didn't make a note of a few questions as you went through comments, and Councilmember Zorns had some additional questions about maximum building length. Is that something you wanted to address now, or would you like to meet separately, or?
It depends on, if everybody's feeling very clear on it, then you can talk through that with me.
Okay.
But,
One thing I
whatever's
didn't
easiest.
mention, so there's two requirements regarding building length. There's the requirement for the primary building mass, which is what I illustrated in that we made some tweaks to in the code. There's also a requirement for smaller scale articulation of building mass that requires either bay windows, like you see on the north side of the city hall, or indentations or offsets in the building plane more frequently than the primary building mass requirements. So those are all requirements that as projects come in and we apply the code, that we're always looking at, what does it make sense? Are there tweaks needed to the requirement? So far, other than the change that we made on the primary building mass, those seem to be working fairly well, in our opinion.
So we can follow up with you on that in more detail, but I think the main point is that there are some things that we put into the code that when we get to the practical application, sometimes we have to make interpretations to make them work. So we want to make sure that we always keep the intent of the code in mind as we do that. And this is one where we were able to do some modifications through interpretation, still make the building work and do what was intended, which was to break up the building so we didn't have one long facade.
Right. Which I appreciate. I mean, that's a huge, we don't want to look like, post-World War II communism block, structures that are there. When I saw the building length and 104 was brought up, two questions came to my mind. Was when you leave the post office, the visibility turning on to 185th is real dicey. And so was that a dynamic, that I'm just giving you my thought process, was that a dynamic of the building being longer than initially planned? And then going through it today, I realized it's not so much the building length, it's the fact that there's a very wide light pole sitting right there, and it's blocking the vision for that. So there was that concern. And then the other concern was also function, was when we make a building longer, are we still maintaining the same amount of pervious soil for our stormwater? And so those were the two questions that concerned me when we talked about creating a long.
And the pervious area is less of an issue in downtown because I'm assuming we probably allow pretty much full coverage in the downtown on those properties anyway. So it's really less about that than it is about the nature of the pedestrian environment that we're trying to create along the street front.
They still need to deal with their stormwater runoff, but we do allow, in the core, lot line to lot line development. In the case of the 104, those open spaces, those little plazas, are actually over the parking. So they're, if they aren't really contributing to the pervious surface there. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Anything else, or are we motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Moved by the Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councilmember McAuliffe. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. We are adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.